Kansas Territory, 1873, the first time Juliet Ashby saw the noose. It was swinging in the breeze outside the sheriff's office in Dodge City. And she knew right then she needed a husband by sundown, or at least the lie of one. She stepped off the dusty street and into the saloon, heart pounding, skirts dusty from 3 days of travel. Her bonnet was crooked, one boot had a tear, and the satchel she clutched held only a worn photograph, a letter never sent, and a Colt .45 she had no idea how to shoot. She pushed through the crowd of loud men and stale whiskey, eyes scanning for anyone fool enough to help her, and then she saw him. He was sitting alone at a corner table, boots up, hat tilted low over his eyes. Tall, lean, with a rifle leaned against his chair and a half-drunk cup of coffee on the table. Something about him struck her, maybe the stillness in the middle of the noise, maybe the way the light hit his face just right. He looked like the kind of man who did not ask questions. She walked straight up, slammed her hand on the table and said, "You are my husband, just for today, please." He looked up, blue eyes sharp and clear beneath the brim. He did not move, just stared at her like he was trying to figure out who she was beneath the dust and panic. "I got a man chasing me," she whispered. "He is dangerous. He is here, and if he finds me alone, I am dead." The man blinked once, then slowly set his cup down. "What's your name?" "Juliet Ashby. I came from Abilene." He studied her, then stood up without another word. "Name's Elias Vaughn." She followed him outside, clinging to his arm as he led her down the street like they belonged to each other. Her heart beat so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. When they passed the sheriff, Elias nodded. "Afternoon." "My wife and I are just headin' to the mercantile." The sheriff looked at Juliet, then tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Elias tightened his grip on her arm and they moved on. When they rounded the corner and were out of sight, Juliet sagged against the wall, breath leaving her in a rush. "I owe you," she said. "I did not do it for free," Elias muttered. "Now tell me who is after you." She hesitated, but something in his voice made her speak. "Clayton Reeve. He used to be a Pinkerton, now he sells people. He took my sister last year, I got away, he found me again in Newton." "Said I belonged to him." Elias's jaw worked. "You got proof of that?" Juliet reached into her satchel and pulled out a letter, folded and stained. Elias opened it. It was from her sister, dated last spring. He read it, then looked at her. "Where is she?" "Dead," Juliet said softly. "Clayton left her in a ravine outside Wichita." Elias's hand clenched the paper. He looked up the street, eyes hard. "You still in danger?" Juliet nodded. "He is here. I saw him from the stage window." Elias took a deep breath, then said, "Come with me. I got a homestead west of town." "Nobody will find you there," she stared. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I got 2 kids who were left behind by a woman who ran. I know what it looks like when someone is trying to survive." Juliet's breath caught. "You have children?" "Samuel is 9. Susanna is 7. They are good kids. I raised them alone." She nodded. "I will not cause trouble." Elias gave her a look. "You already have." He led her to his horse, helped her up, and they rode out of town as the sun dropped low behind them. The homestead was a 2-room cabin tucked into a grove of cottonwoods, a creek running nearby. As they rode in, 2 small figures looked up from the porch. The boy jumped to his feet, rifle in hand, until Elias raised a hand. "Easy, Sam. This is Miss Juliet. She's going to stay a while." Samuel lowered the rifle and studied Juliet with narrowed eyes. Susanna stood next to him, quiet, holding a wooden doll with a broken arm. "Are you our new mother?" she asked softly. Elias looked sharply at Juliet, but she knelt beside the girl and smiled. "No, sweetheart, just a friend." That night, Juliet helped Susanna brush her hair and sat with Samuel while he read from a tattered book. Elias watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying little. Later, when the children were asleep, Juliet stepped outside. Elias stood by the fence, smoking. "I am sorry I lied," she said. "You were scared," he answered. "I still am." He looked at her then. "You can stay as long as you need, but we will have to keep pretending until Clayton moves on." "I understand." He flicked the ash from his cigarette. "If you are going to be here, the kids will need to believe it, at least for their sake." Juliet nodded. "I can do that." He looked at her again, longer this time. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Someone louder. "You are quiet, like you are always listening." Juliet smiled. I've learned it is safer that way, Elias nodded once. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start early. Over the next week, Juliet worked from dawn till dusk. She cooked, mended clothes, helped Elias in the garden, taught Susanna how to sew, and showed Samuel how to trap rabbits. Every night they sat by the fire, and Elias would read aloud while the children curled up beside him. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Elias handed her a tin cup of coffee and said, "They like you. I like them too." He sat beside her, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. "You ever have a family?" "No," she said. "My mother died young. My sister raised me, then she was taken." Elias nodded. "You never married?" Juliet looked down. "I never had the chance." He was quiet for a long moment, then he reached out and touched her hand. "Just a brush, but it made her heart skip." "I ain't been close to anyone in a long time," he said. Juliet looked up at him. "Me neither." They sat like that, hands barely touching, the fire crackling low. Neither of them moved, and neither of them wanted to. The first frost settled quiet over the prairie grass the next morning, a silver hush that made the world feel still. Juliet wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before stepping outside. Elias had already gone to the barn, and the children were gathering kindling along the creek's edge, their voices low, careful not to disturb the hush that came with cold air. She walked to the side of the cabin, where a wooden trough held a thin film of ice. She cracked it gently with the back of a ladle, watching her breath curl in front of her. The steadiness of the place had begun to seep into her bones, routine, rhythm, a kind of quiet belonging she hadn't expected to miss. Elias returned with hay clinging to his sleeves. He rubbed his palms down his trousers and nodded toward the house. "You know how to make soap?" he asked. She glanced at him. "Lion fat," he gave a short nod. "Going to need some before the month turns. I've got ash from the stove, and the neighbor's pig gave us enough tallow last spring." "If you're willing." "I am." He looked at her for a beat longer than needed. "You sleep all right?" She hesitated. "Mostly." He didn't press, just said, "Let me know if he shows." Juliet folded her arms. "You think he's still in Dodge?" "I think men like that don't quit easy." Inside, the children had started pulling dried herbs from the rafters where they'd been hung to cure. Juliet tied her apron and joined them, showing Susanna how to strip the leaves without bruising them. The girl's fingers were small and careful, her eyes darting to Juliet's face now and then, like she was trying to understand something without asking. Later, while the stew simmered and the wind picked up outside, Elias brought in a fresh-cut pine branch and set it near the hearth. "Storm's coming," he said. "Winds from the north." Samuel stood from the table. "You want me to board the barn windows?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Think you can manage it if you give me the hammer." Elias handed it over without a word. Juliet watched the boy disappear outside. "He's sure of himself." He had to be. She didn't ask more. Instead, she crossed to the fire and stirred the pot. The broth had thickened, and the scent of thyme and root vegetables filled the room. When she turned back, Elias had moved closer, not enough to crowd, but enough that she felt the heat of him stronger than the fire. "You always carry that pistol?" he asked. She nodded. "It's not loaded," he blinked. "Why not?" "I've never shot a man. I wasn't sure I could." He lowered his eyes. "Might be time to learn." She studied him, the way his hand tightened on the back of the chair. "Have you?" "Twice," he said. "Once in the war, once after. I don't think about either." She didn't answer, only returned to the fire. The wind howled harder now, shutters rattling. Elias stepped to the door and bolted it. Night came early with the storm, pressing against the windows. The stew was finished, and they ate with spoons scraping the bottoms of their bowls. After, the children curled on the floor near the hearth, Samuel reading aloud from the same book as before. Elias sat beside Juliet on the bench, arms resting on his knees, gaze steady on the flames. "You feel different now," he said, voice low. She tilted her head. "How?" "Like you've stopped looking over your shoulder." Juliet watched the firelight flicker across the stone. "I don't know if I have. But I don't feel alone anymore." He turned to her. "That mattered to you a great deal." He reached out, not to touch, but to rest his hand near hers, close enough to feel. "You don't have to pretend now, Juliet." She looked down at their hands. "I'm not pretending anymore." The wind screamed once against the roof and then softened into a long hush. The fire crackled. Susanna turned in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like a song. Elias didn't speak again that night. He didn't need to. Juliet stayed beside him until the fire burned low, her hand brushing his just once, enough to promise more. By the third week, the ground had hardened beneath the cold and frost became a morning certainty. The days were shorter but not slow. Juliet rose before light to help with the fire, her hands chapped from washing and chopping, her body learning the rhythm of land and work as it never had before. The cabin had its own quiet pulse now, and she moved within it like she'd belonged longer than she had. Elias came in from the barn late that afternoon, brushing dirt from his palms. He looked toward the corner of the room where Samuel was fitting a new string to a homemade bow, and then toward Juliet, who was kneading dough on the table with her sleeves rolled to the elbows. "You ever done any hunting?" he asked, tugging off his gloves. She didn't glance up. "Only what I could trap, snares mostly. Once used a kettle lid to catch a squirrel." "That work?" he asked, one brow raised. "Only once." "I missed the second time and had to give up the lid." Elias chuckled under his breath and leaned against the wall. "Got snares out by the ridge now. Could use another pair of eyes tomorrow." Juliet brushed flour from her hands and nodded. "I'll come." Susanna, seated near the hearth with a needle and thread, tilted her head. "Are you going to be out all day?" Elias answered before Juliet could. "Just the morning." "You'll mind things here with your brother." The girl nodded solemnly and returned to her sewing, lips pursed with the patience of someone being taken seriously. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Juliet sat on the porch with Elias, the wind quiet and the stars sharp overhead. The cold settled into the wood beneath them, but neither moved. Elias held a tin of tobacco in one hand, turning it slowly. "What happened to their mother?" Juliet asked. He didn't look at her. "She left before Susanna could talk in full sentences, went back east, couldn't take the waiting." "Or the distance?" Juliet wrapped her arms around herself. "Did she write?" "Once. Said she'd found a place in St. Louis. Sent a pair of boots for Samuel. They were too small." He set the tin down beside his boot and leaned forward, elbows to knees. She wanted something different. "I don't blame her for that." Juliet watched the shadow of his jaw shift in the starlight. "You ever think of leaving too?" He didn't answer right away. "I did, right after the war. Had a satchel packed, even bought a ticket for a train that never came." "Why didn't you go?" He looked at her then, voice low. "Because there was no one waiting for me anywhere else." Juliet said nothing, but her chest ached with the weight of it. She reached over and touched his wrist, just a brush of skin. He didn't pull away. In the morning, they left before the sun crested the hills, riding double on Elias's horse, the fields still stiff with frost. The snares were set along a gully west of the cottonwoods, and they moved in silence, Elias showing her the signs. Turned leaves, bent grass, broken twigs. They found 2 rabbits and a possum, which Elias dispatched with a swift, practiced motion. "You don't flinch," he said, handing her the sack. "I've seen worse." He didn't press further. They rode back through the lower creek bed where the water had thinned to a trickle. A red-tailed hawk circled above, and Juliet tilted her head to watch it. Elias noticed. "You like birds?" "I used to think they were watching over us," she said. "My sister said that was foolish, but I still look." He nodded once, thoughtful. Back at the cabin, Susanna greeted them with a drawing she'd done in charcoal. Juliet and Elias standing beneath a tree, holding hands with the children beside them. The likeness was childish, but something in it caught Juliet in the chest. Samuel shrugged when Elias looked over his shoulder. She wanted to draw a family. Juliet crouched beside Susanna. "That's a good tree. Is it the one near the creek?" The girl nodded. "It's my favorite." Juliet glanced up at Elias, who met her eyes and said nothing, but his gaze lingered, steady as a promise. That night, after the children were asleep, Juliet opened the drawer near the hearth and pulled out the letter from her sister. She hadn't looked at it since arriving. The edges were worn now from travel and time, but the words hadn't changed. She sat by the fire, holding it in her lap when Elias came in from the barn. He stood behind her a moment, reading her silence. "I can't make it right," he said gently. "But I can keep you safe." She looked up at him, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers. "I don't want to hide anymore. You're not." He stepped closer, kneeling beside her. "You're here, you're living, that's not hiding." Juliet folded the letter and set it back in the drawer. Then she turned toward him, her voice quiet but sure. "Do you want me here, Elias?" He didn't pause. "Yes." She reached for his hand, and this time he took hers fully. Their fingers twined, warm and certain, neither of them looked away. The snow came sudden and heavy that night, blanketing the prairie in silence so thick it seemed the whole world held its breath. By morning, the trees sagged with the weight of it, and the fence line disappeared beneath a soft, endless white. Juliet stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a cup of boiled chicory, watching the clouds hang low over the ridge. Elias was already outside, shoveling a path from the porch to the barn. His coat dark with moisture, his breath rising in strong bursts, he moved steady and sure, like nothing about the storm surprised him. Juliet watched him pause at the gate, lean on his shovel, and scan the tree line. Samuel and Susanna sat cross-legged on the floor near the stove, piecing together a puzzle of whittled animal shapes they'd carved over the last week. The silence inside was nearly as thick as that outside, but it was a warm quiet, the kind that wrapped itself around the bones. Juliet stepped away from the window and pulled on her boots. "You going out?" Susanna asked, not looking up. "I won't be long," Juliet said, buttoning her coat. Outside, the wind had softened, the air sharp but clean. She walked slowly, each step crunching through the thick layer beneath her. Elias didn't turn when he heard her, just set the shovel aside and brushed snow from his gloves. "You ever seen snow like this in Abilene?" he asked. "I never stayed long enough in one place to watch the seasons change." Elias nodded, eyes still on the trees. "There's tracks out past the south fence, not fresh but not more than a day old." She followed his gaze. "Could be a fox. Could be." He turned to her then. "Could be someone looking for something." Juliet felt the old unease tighten at her ribs. "Do you think it's him?" "I don't know. But I'd rather be ready." They walked along the edge of the barn where the snow was thinner beneath the overhang. Juliet stopped at the shed door, her hand on the latch. "I want to learn," she said. "How to use it." Elias looked at her, his face unreadable. "You sure I won't be helpless again?" He didn't ask more. Inside, he pulled the Colt from its place beneath the workbench and set it on the table. "We'll start with how to hold it, then how to breathe." The cold settled into her fingers as she mimicked his grip, but she didn't complain. It took time. Her hand shook at first, the weight unfamiliar, but Elias was patient. He never raised his voice, never rushed her. When she finally pulled the trigger and the hammer fell on an empty chamber with a dry snap, she didn't flinch. "That's better," he said. "You'll fire it tomorrow." Juliet exhaled slowly. "I didn't think I'd feel steady. You've been steady a long time, just didn't know it." They stayed in the shed until the light started to fade. As they stepped into the dusk, Juliet glanced at the ridge again. The trees stood quiet, unmoving. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Elias brought in a box from the barn. He set it on the table and opened it, revealing a worn fiddle with a missing string. "My father played," he said. "I haven't touched it since the war." Juliet reached out, brushing her fingers over the wood. "Can you still remember the songs?" "Some." He sat, lifted the bow, and adjusted the pegs. The first few notes were rough, but then a tune emerged slow and low, something that felt older than either of them. Juliet closed her eyes and listened, letting it settle into her skin. When the song ended, she looked at him. "You never said you played. Didn't think it mattered." "It does." He set the fiddle down carefully. "You sound like you know something about that." "My sister sang," Juliet said. "When we were girls, she'd sing to chase away the dark. She said every voice has a place it belongs, even if it's quiet." Elias leaned back in his chair. "What about yours?" It never had a place before. He watched her for a long time, his expression softening in a way she hadn't seen before. "It has one now." Juliet stood, walked toward him slow, each step measured. When she reached him, she rested her hand on his shoulder and he covered it with his own. "I don't know what this is yet," she said, "but I want to stay." He stood and faced her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then stay." When he kissed her, it was without urgency, without fear. It was a promise, not a question. And Juliet answered it by leaning in, steady and sure, like she'd known him all her life. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and soundless. Inside, the fire burned low, and for the first time in years, Juliet didn't feel hunted. She felt home. The tracks reappeared 2 days later, barely impressions on the crusted snow, but Elias knew the shape of a man's step when he saw it. He didn't call for Juliet right away. He walked the line himself, rifle slung across his back, stepping careful along the ridge above the creek. When he bent to study the prints near a stand of ash trees, he found a scrap of dark wool snagged in the bark. Not a fox, not a neighbor. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun hovered low, throwing long shadows across the bluff. Juliet was ladling bean stew into bowls while Susanna folded strips of muslin near the fire. Samuel sat sharpening a small blade, his eyes flicking toward the window more often than usual. Elias shut the door behind him and hung his coat. "We'll need to bring the horses in tonight." Juliet looked up, her face unreadable. "Is it him?" He gave a single nod. "He's close." She didn't ask how close, just set the ladle down and wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll help with the tack." That night, all four of them slept in the main room. Elias stayed near the door, rifle across his lap. Juliet settled with the children on the pallet, her back to the wall and her eyes open far too long. Outside, the wind had died, and the cold fell sharp and clean under the stars. In the gray hush before dawn, a knock came, 3 slow raps, deliberate. Elias stood before the second echo faded, rifle raised. Juliet rose behind him, the Colt already in her hand. Samuel sat up without a word and pulled Susanna close. "Who's there?" Elias called, voice low but firm. "Name's Reeve," came the answer. "I believe you've got something of mine." Juliet stepped forward, her hand steady. "You're not getting it back." A pause. "Then, seems you've made a mistake, miss. I came to collect what belongs to me." Elias opened the door just wide enough to see the man's face lined in gray at the temples, but the eyes behind the brim were sharp and smug. Reeve stood alone, hands raised, a pistol holstered at his side. "This is private land," Elias said. "You've got no claim here. I've got her name in my ledger." Juliet stepped beside Elias. "Then burn the book. I'm not a line you can own." Reeve's eyes narrowed. "You'll come with me or this gets loud." Elias didn't move. "You take one more step past that fence and I'll bury you in the snow you're standing in." Reeve's hand twitched toward his hip, but he was old, and Elias didn't hesitate. One shot cracked the morning stillness. Reeve stumbled back, fell hard, and didn't rise. The snow beneath him bloomed red. Juliet didn't speak, only lowered the Colt and turned toward the children. Samuel was already pulling a blanket around Susanna's shoulders, his own jaw set hard. Elias walked out alone, checked the man's pulse, then dragged the body to the edge of the bluff. He'd dig the grave himself. By noon, the ground had given enough, and the deed was done. Elias returned to the cabin with snow clinging to his boots and silence in his chest. Juliet met him at the doorway. "You didn't have to do it alone. I didn't want you to see more of him." "I've seen worse," she said, then reached for his hand. Elias caught it and held on. Afterward, life unfolded without rush. The snow melted slow, exposing brown earth that turned green again come April. Juliet planted onions and carrots in neat rows, while Samuel built a new fence section by hand. Susanna followed Juliet everywhere, learning stitches and flower measurements, and sometimes just sitting close without speaking. One evening, Elias brought home a length of blue calico he'd bartered in town. Juliet looked at him, puzzled. "It's not practical," she said. "It doesn't have to be," he replied. She wore it to supper the next Sunday, the fabric summer light against her skin. Elias couldn't look away. That night, while the children slept, he took her hand and led her outside where the stars blinked through the branches. "You never asked me to stay," she whispered. "I didn't want to ask something you weren't ready to give." She turned to him. "I'm ready now." He kissed her beneath the cottonwoods, slow and steady, not like a man claiming anything, but like one offering everything. They were married in June, under the same tree Susanna had drawn in charcoal months before. The preacher from Dodge rode out with a Bible and a grin, and Samuel stood as witness. Susanna carried a basket of wildflowers, and afterward they ate stew and bread with honey, and the children danced while Elias played the fiddle. That night, with the lanterns out and the cabin quiet, Juliet lay beside Elias, her head tucked into the crook of his shoulder. "Do you still think about leaving?" she asked. He turned to press his lips to her hair. "Not once since you came," she smiled into his chest. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." Years passed. The cabin grew board by board, a new room for the children, a lean-to for the mule. Juliet taught Susanna to read, and Samuel started carving furniture instead of traps. They never spoke of Reeve again. He belonged to another life. Each winter came with its own quiet, but none of them carried fear anymore. Only the hush of snow, the crackle of fire, and the soft rhythm of a home that had been built, not found. And through it all, Juliet and Elias stood side by side, not because they needed rescuing, but because they had chosen each other, day after day, storm after storm. They grew old in that house, hands weathered, love constant, a life made not from what had been taken, but what they built together, one quiet morning at a time.